So in this video, we're going to reflect back on React Conf 2024, some of the talks and the main topics and concepts that was introduced. And then we're going to also talk about React 19 release candidate, the new features coming into React 19. We have had videos on the channel talking about new features coming down the line in React 19, but we're going to go through them more specifically here, pointing to relevant videos and maybe probably future videos that we need to do on some of the concepts. So as I mentioned 2 weeks ago, React Conf was held place in person after I think 4 years now, because the last one was only online, if I'm not mistaken. There's a bunch of great talks in the conference. If you haven't watched it, either watch it or at least you can now hear the ones that I feel like you have to, that they're a must watch if you want to get into the new concepts in React 19. There was a lot of talks about server components, obviously coming now in React 19 as a stable feature. There was also an introduction of React compiler, which is a compiler for React, trying to automatically memoize your React application, so you no longer would have need to use manual APIs like use memo, use callback. But also a lot of other new features that you might have been already familiar with if you're using Next.js like me, because Next.js is using the Canary version of React, which had access to all of these features early before they even become stable. There has been some new changes, a little updates in those APIs that we're going to review together here. But in my opinion, if you haven't watched the whole talk, what I like to watch if you want to understand server components is the talk by Dan Abramov, React for Two Computers, is a story, a concept to introduce React as one application that runs on two computers, one being the server and the other one being the client. And it's a good way of understanding React server components, or this new way of providing your data from server components to your client components. There's more talks about understanding server components. There was another one by Evan Bacon from the Expo team and the Expo router, now introducing universal React server components that also would make sense of React server components and why they are a good addition to the React ecosystem. So definitely watch these two to understand more about server components. As far as the React compiler goes, definitely watch Lauren Tan. There's 2 talks about compiler. One is Forget About Memo by Lauren Tan, and the other one is a more deep dive, more examples by other team members of the React team that you can kind of watch and see what the compiler is supposed to do. They go through live code examples as well. And as far as what's new in React 19, we're going to go through them step by step right now. But if you want to watch the React Conf, definitely watch What's New in React 19 by Lydia Halley. She goes through all of the concepts that we're going to touch on in this video in that talk as well. She has a great way of explaining complex stuff in a very simple way, in my opinion. So definitely watch that to wrap your head around what's coming down in React 19. Now, with that out of the way, let's just jump into this blog post about React 19 release candidate and go through step by step, go through the new updates that's coming in React 19. We're going to explain the ones that are new, some of which we are already familiar with through Next.js. We're going to point to videos where we've explained these features, and then probably we're going to do some future videos on some of these concepts, specifically the React compiler coming soon, if you want to understand it with more code examples. So let's dive right in. So as I mentioned, React 19 release candidate, or RC, is now out. We had a video on the channel talking about what's coming in React 19, kind of pointing out to some of these features. This is a more comprehensive list that we're going to review together. Some of these concepts we have already used through Next.js, since we had access to them early through the Canary channel in Next.js app router. Some of them are new and have updated, and some possibly require independent videos for us to dive deeper in future, like the React compiler. So the new addition to React 19 is something that's called actions. Now, actions, simply put, are functions that are using asynchronous transitions. So down here, you can see functions that use asynchronous transitions are called actions. Now we have the concept of server actions or action prop that we have on the forms, which might make this confusing. But to understand this better is that we had something called transitions in, I think, React 18. So transitions has been a part of React for almost a year now. But the limitation with transitions in React 18 or whatever version that is that we could not pass an async function to our transition. So we couldn't mark a transition as async. It needed to be synchronous. I have a video on the channel talking about the use transition hook or transitions in React with 3 different use cases or example use cases. I'm going to link it in the description. So watch that video because we dive deeper into understanding what transitions are, how the API looks like, and we put it in practice in 3 different use cases, which would definitely help you understand transitions better. The only thing that has changed since that video is that now we can pass async functions to our transitions, which are called actions in React 19. So it's kind of transitions, which is a way to mark your state updates as non-urgent or low priority to then allow the user to interact with the UI instead of blocking the UI. And this is now a replacement for example, handling something that we would have done like this. So if you are mutating some data, in this case, you're updating a name, and then you are then updating a local state. Traditionally would have been implemented like with a pending UI, a loading state, an error state, and a local state for your data. On submit of this form or this button, you would have just set loading state, update the name, set the loading back to false, handle errors, and then redirect to that specific path for that updated name. Now, this can easily be done with transitions, which is going to automatically take care of the loading state because it returns an is pending state when the transition or when the request starts. And then you can further down even make use of the automatic behavior of actions that allow you to manage pending state. It ties nicely into optimistic updates using the new use optimistic hook. We also covered this on a video on the channel. So if you don't know the use optimistic hook, which allows you to optimistically update the UI before an action is completed. Now the actions tie back into this. It also allows you to render an error boundary and display an error if the action returns or fails, and then it reverts originally back to the original value, kind of reverting your optimistic update. And then you can also now use actions on forms, which ties into the new action prop that is available on the forms. Again, we have also used this through Next.js. We had hooks such as use form state and use form status in Next.js to allow us to pass an action or a server action to our forms, get the state of the form back, and then use that for error handling. There's a video on the channel about use form state and use form status that shows error handling and state management for forms using server actions and these 2 new hooks. The only difference is that the use action state, which is the new hook, used to be called use form state exported from React DOM, but now it's part of React and it's called use action state. Now the API and the signature of this hook is exactly the same as how it used to be before. So you can reference the video linked in the description to learn how you would use this to manage your forms using actions or server actions. We also show how you can use the use form state to render pending state or a button that hooks into the parent state or the parent form state to handle your forms using these new hooks from React. Now, going back to the React 19 blog post, we talked about the use action state. Actions also integrate into forms via the action prop or the form action prop of input and button elements. This combined with server actions, which we're going to learn down later in this blog post, or we've already talked about in Next.js, in the context of Next.js, is going to be an alternative to handling form submission in the new React 19 or Next.js applications. So instead of having an API layer to handle the form submission and send a post request to your API endpoint, you can define a server action, and server actions are just actions or functions that you define on the server, but you can call them on the client. So you pass your server actions either to the use action state to get an action back and pass it to the form action prop, or you just pass them directly to the action prop of your form. And then upon submission, this action is going to execute the function you defined on the server and automatically reset the form after this submission using a transition tying into the use optimistic hook or the use form status, which we touched on and we've already talked about in previous videos. Again, watch the videos that I'm going to link in the description to see all of these things in action. I'm glossing over them now, but if you want to dive deeper into any of these topics, we have individual videos talking about them. Use form status is a way for you to hook into the status of a form on a parent element. So just like a context where you would share a state without prop drilling, now you can share the status of a form to child components via the use form status. For example, here they're showing a pending button when the parent form is actually in a pending state, which is coming from the action which is in transition. Again, the use optimistic hook allows you to optimistically update the UI as if the action was successfully completed, and it automatically reverts back to the original value if it fails. It ties into your transitions or your actions, also server actions with the action prop of a form. We also have a video specifically for the optimistic UI on the channel where we show this in more details. Link in the description if you want to learn more. Now, another API is the use API or the use function. I called this a use hook in the past. Maybe it was called a use hook back in React documentation as well. I'm not sure. There's a video on the channel, so if you look at it, I called it a use hook. I haven't changed it, but I'm just now referencing it now. The use is not a hook because it doesn't follow the rules of React for hooks. You can call it inside conditional statements. It doesn't need to follow those rules. The API is the same as what I have already described in that video, in that it allows you to consume a context or a promise. So it's a very good way if you want to send a promise from the server to the client. So instead of fetching the data and passing the data to the client, you can start the fetch or start the request and pass the promise to the client, and then pass the promise to the use API, and then get the result back inside the API. In the video that we have on the channel, the use case we have this from server to client is actually for internationalization, where we load our translation object on the server from our local files and then pass the promise to the client so that you can use this new use API or function to consume that promise, get the translation JSON, and then use the specific translation that you want on the client side. Because a common question that I got after the internationalization or the I-18N video that we put out is, what do you do for client components? Because everything we show is for server components because we have access to our local files and the translation objects. For client components, you either have to pass the scope that you need through props, or if you want to share the whole translation object, you could use the use function. Again, I have shown this in detail in that video, linked in the description if you want to learn the new use API. Again, I called it use hook because probably they called it use hook back then, but now we know it's not a hook. They call it a new API. And the second use case, as I mentioned, is to consume or hook into a context, just like the use context hook. Now you can pass a context to use and then get the value of whatever it is that was shared through the context. Now, React Server Components is next. If you've been following along on the channel, we've talked about server components a ton. We have had access to this since Next.js 13 about a year ago, which was the introduction of the app router, which is built on top of React Server Components and suspense or streaming. So you probably are familiar with this. Now with React 19, you can have access to server components outside of Next.js. Now any React application can benefit from this, but it is still is tied or coupled very tightly with the framework that you're using. So you can reference the framework that you're using for server components. I don't think we need any more explanation on server components here. Server actions, as I already touched on, are just functions that you define on the server, and then you can call them on client components. To define a function as a server action, you need to use the use server directive up top. You can either define server actions in server components and pass them as props to client components, or you can just import them in client components. For example, you can just define all of your actions in a specific file, use the use server directive up top, which marks all of the functions in that file or module as server actions, and then import each one of those files that you need inside of a client component, for example, to pass it to a form, which then executes that server action on the server. Now, a common mistake that I see is people marking server components with this use server. This is not to mark a component as server component. Server components don't need any directive. They are by default server components. If you need a client component, you just pass the use client directive up top. If you don't pass it, it is considered a server component. The use server, on the other hand, is to mark a server action, not a server component. So a little note to keep in mind when using server actions or server components. Now, the rest of this blog post talks about improvements in React 19, two of which I'm going to address here, and the rest you can read through. First one is ref is now a prop. You no longer need the forward ref to be able to pass a ref from a component to a child component, which is great, much easier to use. You had an input, you can pass in any prop together with a ref to then pass into the underlying input that you have, which is this input component or input element that we're using here. So it receives the refs and pass it there without having to use the forward ref. It was a lot cumbersome to use the forward ref inside of our component, so you no longer need that. That's the first improvement. And then the second one that I want to talk about is the context. So you no longer need the context as a provider. You can just use the context that you create by calling the create context function. So as you can see here, I don't have the theme context dot provider. I just have the theme context. You can then consume this context using the use context hook, or using the new use function or the use API, pass the same context to it to just resolve the context that you're sharing here. Now, from your refs that you pass in, you can return cleanup functions. You can read through the use cases here. There's also the use deferred value, the initial value actually for this hook, support for document metadatas. So you can now pass in metadata and links for loading resources to your React elements. And these are going to be automatically hoisted up to the head tag of your component. So definitely have a look at the rest of this blog post if these are of any use to you. And that's a wrap for this video, folks. We talked about what's coming in React 19. We had multiple videos about the new features and also individual videos diving deeper into these concepts. If you're interested, they're all linked in the description. Transitions, use form state, status use action state, server actions, the new use hook, optimistic UI, and whatnot. Definitely watch the React Conf presentations if you have time. If you don't, at least watch the ones that I pointed out for getting the updates in React 19, understanding server actions better, and the new React compiler. We're going to have a video on the channel talking about React compiler coming up soon, so stay tuned. Until then, if you have any questions, hit me up in the comments, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.